Tommy's cabin was a tomb of silence, its walls steeped in the weight of absence. 3 years since Lena Boone's breath had faded beneath the cottonwood's bent branches. 2 decades since the war had carved his voice into splinters he could never piece back together. Grief clung to him like a second skin, heavy and unrelenting, each day dragging him through snow drifts of memory as if he were hauling a ghost by its frayed hands. His calloused fingers, cracked from mending fences and saddles, trembled faintly as he poured coffee into a chipped mug, a relic from a morning Lena Boone had last used, its rim still stained with the ghost of her lips. The fire in the hearth crackled weakly, casting long shadows that danced over her woven shawl, still draped on the back of her chair, untouched since her hands had last smoothed its threads. Outside, the wind howled like a wolf with a broken leg, its mournful cry slicing through the night. But it wasn't the storm that froze Tommy's blood. It was the sound, a faint, halting whimper that slithered through the gaps in the cabin's logs, threading itself into his bones. He froze, mug halfway to his lips, the steam curling like a question mark in the air. The noise came again, softer this time, almost human. Almost. Stepping outside, his boots crunched into the snow, the moon a sickle blade overhead, carving the world into sharp edges. The cedar tree by the barn loomed like a sentinel, its branches clawing at the sky. Beneath it, a shape lay curled, half buried in white. A girl, no older than 20, her dress torn at the shoulder, blood darkening the snow around her like ink spilled over parchment. Her face, pale and sharp-featured, seemed to flicker in the moonlight, as though it belonged to a memory he'd never lived, a face he'd seen in dreams or funeral hymns. Tommy stood motionless, the cold gnawing at his throat, his mind a storm of questions. Who are you? Why does your silence feel like a dirge? But he didn't speak. He didn't kneel. He only stared, the weight of her body, light as a child's breath, pressing against the hollow in his chest where his own daughter had once nestled before she'd vanished into the void of stillborn silence. When he finally moved, it was with the slow, deliberate care of a man afraid that touch might shatter her into pieces. Lifting her, he felt the chill of her skin seep through his coat, smelled the metallic tang of her blood mingled with river silt and smoke. She stirred faintly, murmuring words in a language that hummed in his marrow. Comanche, maybe, before going still again. Inside, he laid her near the hearth, wrapping her in the only blanket not steeped in Lena Boone's scent, though the cabin itself seemed to exhale grief around her. Her blood left smears on the wool, crimson against gray, a warning or a plea. Tommy worked without thinking, his hands stitching the gash on her arm with the quiet skill of a man who'd once saved lives under fire, before the war had taught him how swiftly they could unravel. She flinched once, her eyelids fluttering, but didn't wake. When he finished, he stepped outside again, letting the wind scour his lungs clean of the weight pressing there. The moon hung lower now, its light pooling around a cedar tree, where Lena Boone's wildflowers had once bloomed each spring, until the earth had forgotten them, just as it had forgotten her. Back inside, the girl had curled closer to the fire, her breathing shallow but steady, her presence a storm now nested in his hearth. Tommy sat in his chair, staring at the flames until dawn, the silence no longer a comfort, but a question mark stretching into the dark. He told himself she'd be gone by morning. But when the sun bled pink over the snow, she remained, and the questions clawing his mind had only grown teeth. She didn't speak, not when Tommy stitched the gash on her arm, his needle threading through flesh with the quiet precision of a man who'd once saved lives under fire, nor when he handed her a strip of jerky, its saltiness sharp against the metallic tang of her blood. Not even when the blizzard screamed against the cabin walls, its wind clawing at the logs like a thing starved of warmth. Her silence wasn't passive. It was a language of its own, a wall built of watchfulness. She observed him with eyes like a hawk tracking prey. Sharp, unblinking, unreadable. They followed his every movement. The way his hands trembled faintly as he poured coffee. The way his shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight only he could feel. When she ate, she did so with deliberate care, chewing slowly on one side of her mouth, her gaze flicking to the shadows where Lena Boone's memory lingered. Tommy felt her scrutiny like a second skin, but he said nothing. Words had always been scarce here, and now, with her, they felt unnecessary. By morning, the snow had swallowed the horizon, turning the world into a blank, unbroken canvas. Tommy noticed the small things she did without prompting, sweeping the hearth until not a speck of ash remained, folding blankets into tight, precise squares, her fingers smoothing each crease as if survival demanded ritual. She moved through the cabin like someone accustomed to making herself useful in spaces that weren't hers, efficient, yet never intrusive. When she knelt to stoke the fire, her braid slung over one shoulder, he saw the faint tremor in her hands, the only sign of vulnerability beneath her composure. She didn't ask for anything, not even the shawl that hung on the back of Lena Boone's chair, though her eyes lingered on it. Tommy left it there, unsure if it was a relic she respected or a ghost she feared. He stepped outside to feed the horses, the cold biting through his coat as he trudged through the snow. The barn loomed like a specter in the pre-dawn gray, its wooden planks groaning under the weight of ice. He reached for the feed bucket, but his boot crunched on something that shouldn't be there. Hoofprints, dozens, maybe more, carved into the snow in tight, deliberate circles around the cabin. His breath hitched, the sound swallowed by the wind. He crouched, gloved fingers brushing the edges of a print. Fresh, deep, made by horses that hadn't fled the storm. His pulse thudded in his ears as he stood, scanning the ridge beyond the pasture. They emerged like figures from a dream or a nightmare. Riders, their silhouettes stark against the pale sky, their faces streaked with ochre and charcoal, paint that turned them into something more than men. Spears jutted upward like jagged teeth, their tips catching the first light of dawn. At their head rode a figure draped in a cloak of wolf fur, its pelt dark as a blood bruise, the animal's skull stitched over the rider's shoulders like a second face. The man's posture was neither tense nor relaxed, a balance of control and readiness, the kind forged by years of command. His horse moved with the certainty of one accustomed to leading a charge, its mane braided with feathers stained red with ochre. Tommy's throat tightened, his hand instinctively brushing the rifle slung over his shoulder. This wasn't a rescue. It was a reckoning. The riders halted at the edge of the clearing, their formation eerily silent. The leader dismounted first, his boots sinking into the snow without hesitation. He was taller than Tommy had expected, his frame lean but solid, his face etched with lines that spoke of winters endured and battles survived. His eyes, dark and unyielding, locked onto Tommy's before flicking to the cabin door. There was no need for questions. The man's presence was a declaration. This is mine. This is blood. This is unfinished. Tommy's mind raced. He thought of the girl inside, her quiet resilience, the way she'd swept the hearth as if claiming a space that wasn't hers. He thought of the gash on her arm, the blood she'd shed before arriving at his door. Had they done it? Or had she run from something worse? The leader's gaze returned to him, and Tommy felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. This was not a man who sought answers. He sought resolution. The wind howled, carrying the scent of snow and smoke. Tommy squared his shoulders, his boots crunching against the frozen earth as he stepped forward. The distance between them narrowed, but the chasm of understanding remained. Behind him, the cabin's door creaked faintly in the wind, a sound like a held breath. Whatever came next, it would not be peace. It would be the settling of debts long overdue. The girl, Kaya Wren, though Tommy would learn her name only later, stood rigid as the warriors closed the circle around the cabin, their painted faces half hidden beneath the low-hanging branches of the cedar tree. Their horses shifted restlessly in the snow, breaths pluming like ghosts into the frigid air. She didn't flinch when her father dismounted, his boots sinking into the frostbitten earth with a sound like bones cracking. Micah Stone moved with the deliberate grace of a man who had spent decades commanding both men and silence, his wolf cloak rippling behind him like a second shadow. Tommy felt the weight of his approach in his ribs, the way a storm presses against the chest before it breaks. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken words, accusations, grief, the raw edges of a bond neither father nor daughter could fully sever. "You sheltered her," Micah Stone said at last, his voice gravel and thunder, low enough to rattle the frozen ground. It wasn't a question. It was an indictment carved into the space between them. Tommy nodded, his throat tight. He wasn't sure if this was a confession or a death sentence. But the rifle above the door felt useless now, a relic of a world where bullets could saw what blood could not. Kaya Wren stepped forward then, her spine straight as an arrow, her eyes sharp enough to pierce the fog of winter. "I didn't run from you," she said, her voice steady but quiet, as if she were speaking not to defy him, but to carve truth into the ice. "I ran from men who take what isn't theirs." Micah Stone's gaze flicked to Tommy, then back to her, his expression unreadable beneath the streaks of ochre on his face. Tommy saw the tension in the man's jaw, the way his fingers twitched toward the knife at his belt. A gesture of restraint, not action. "You belong to our fire," Micah Stone growled, each word deliberate, as though invoking a law older than language itself. "Not anymore," Kaya Wren whispered. The silence that followed stretched thin, brittle as the ice clinging to the cabin's eaves. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, until a gust tore through the clearing, howling like a thing mourning its own voice. It carried the scent of snow and smoke, of old wounds and older promises. Micah Stone remounted without another word, his horse snorting as it shifted beneath him. His warriors did not move to follow immediately, their stillness a question mark hanging over the snow. 3 days, Micah Stone said, his voice cutting through the hush like a blade. "Then I come not as a father, but as a chief." The words landed with finality, a sentence passed in a language Tommy did not speak but understood all the same. And just like that, they vanished, their retreat as coordinated as a flock of birds scattering into a storm. The snow swallowed their tracks almost instantly, but the weight of their presence lingered, pressing against the walls of the cabin like a second winter. Tommy stood rooted in the churned snow, his hands clenched at his sides. Behind him, Kaya Wren exhaled, the sound barely audible but sharp as broken glass. He turned to find her staring at the ridge where they'd disappeared, her shoulders taut, her fists curled at her sides. The firelight from the cabin caught the edge of her profile, softening the hard lines of her face, but not the resolve in her eyes. She looked younger now, not in age, but in vulnerability, as though the storm had stripped her down to something raw and unguarded. "You should go with them," Tommy said, the words escaping before he could stop them. He didn't believe it, but the lie felt necessary, a way to test the strength of the choice he wasn't ready to make. Kaya Wren's head snapped toward him, her gaze burning with a mixture of defiance and something softer. Fear, maybe, or the ache of a decision she couldn't unmake. "And go where?" she asked, her voice low but edged with steel. "Back to silence? Back to marrying a man who sees me as a treaty, not a person?" Tommy had no answer. There were no maps for this kind of journey, no guideposts in the snow. He thought of the cradle in the corner of the room, the one he'd stopped building years ago, and the hollow ache in his chest that had become a second heartbeat. Kaya Wren stepped closer, her breath visible in the cold, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a secret. "You gave me a room that didn't lock," she said. "That was enough." The fire inside the cabin crackled faintly, a sound too small to fill the silence stretching between them. Tommy looked down at his hands, rough and scarred, and wondered if they could hold something as fragile as hope. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. The storm was coming, he knew, but for now, there was only this: a girl who had brought a war to his doorstep and a man who had spent too long hiding from the living. 3 days. That was all they had before the sky split open. The fire crackled as Tommy stared into the flames, the weight of 3 days pressing on his chest like a vice tightening with every breath. The cabin's shadows danced wildly against the walls, casting long, flickering specters of his past. Lena Boone's shawl draped over the chair, the unfinished cradle in the corner, the rifle above the door gleaming faintly in the firelight. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, the silence was heavier, thickened by unspoken fears. Kaya Wren sat across the room, her back straight, her fingers moving like water as she wove leather strips into a pouch. The strips were dyed deep blue, the color Tommy had bought in town, now stitched into something new, something hers. Her hands worked with quiet precision, the needle flashing like a star in the dark, each loop a deliberate act of reclaiming. She didn't flinch when he finally spoke, her focus unwavering. "You should go with them," he said, the words raw, as though dragged from his throat. She paused, the leather still in her hands, her expression unreadable. "And go where?" she asked, her voice low but edged with steel. "Back to silence? Back to marrying a man who sees me as a treaty, not a person?" Tommy looked down at his own hands, rough and scarred, the hands of a man who had built fences but never bridges. He had no answer. There were no maps for this kind of journey, no guideposts in the snow. She stood abruptly, crossing to the window in a single fluid motion, her braids swinging like a pendulum of defiance. Her breath fogged the glass, a ghostly bloom that lingered before fading. "You gave me a room that didn't lock," she said, not turning to face him. That was enough. Outside, the tracks of 70 horses lingered in the snow, etched into the white like scars, a warning, a promise, or a curse. The storm returned that night, not with snow, but with wind that clawed at the cabin's logs, howling like a thing mourning its own voice. Tommy didn't sleep. He sat in his chair by the fire, the flames casting jagged shadows that mimicked the turmoil in his chest. Kaya Wren's silhouette at the window was sharp against the pale glow of moonlight, her eyes scanning the dark for something he couldn't see. He watched the way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers brushed the glass, as if tracing invisible lines in the air. Was she looking for the riders? Or for a path forward, one that neither her father nor the world had drawn for her? He thought of the cradle again, its wood smooth beneath his calloused hands, the way he had carved it for a daughter who had never taken her first breath. Now, here was Kaya Wren, alive and unyielding, a storm in human form. She was no fragile thing to be tucked into a bed or buried beneath traditions. She was a woman who had chosen to stay, not because she needed him, but because she wanted to, and yet, the weight of her choice pressed on him. What if he failed her? What if Micah Stone returned not as a father dial tone, but as a chief, and Tommy could not shield her from the firestorm he had unwittingly invited? Kaya Wren turned suddenly, her gaze meeting his in the dim light. "You don't have to watch me," she said, her voice softer now, almost gentle. "I'm not going anywhere." But the truth hung between them. She could. She should. And the thought of her riding away, vanishing into the horizon with her father's warriors, felt like a blade twisting in his ribs. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I know," he lied. The fire spat, a log collapsing into embers, and in the sudden flare of light, he saw her more clearly. The resilience in her posture, the wariness in her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands as she gripped the windowsill. She was not fearless. She was afraid, but she stood anyway. Like Lena Boone had, when she planted wildflowers around the cedar tree every spring, knowing they would never bloom after winter took her. Like Kaya, Wren's mother, who had washed her hair in the river until sickness stole her. Like the girl herself, who had run from a life carved by others' hands and dared to stitch her own. When dawn bled through the shutters, pink and pale, Tommy was still awake. Kaya Wren had fallen asleep at the window, her cheek pressed to the glass, her fist curled like she might fight the darkness even in dreams. He rose quietly, draping a blanket over her shoulders, his fingers lingering for a moment on her arm. The fire hissed as he added another log, sparks rising like startled birds. Outside, the wind had stilled, but the tracks remained, 70 hooves imprinted in the snow, a map of what was coming. Tommy stared at them until his eyes blurred, the weight of 3 days stretching thin as the sky. He told himself he would decide by morning. But morning came, and the choice still clawed at him, raw and unresolved. By the second day, the air felt charged, like lightning trapped in ice, a stillness that prickled the skin and made every sound sharper, every shadow deeper. Tommy moved through his chores with the methodical precision of a man trying to outrun his thoughts. He checked the fences, their splintered rails dusted with frost, his gloved hands lingering on the knots where the wood had cracked. The horses shifted uneasily in the pasture, their breath pluming in the brittle air, their ears twitching at every distant rustle. Even the rifle above the door, its barrel gleaming faintly in the firelight, felt useless now, a relic of a world where threats could be named and faced head-on. Outside, the ridge loomed like a question mark, its contours sharpened by the pale light of a sun that refused to warm the earth. Kaya Wren worked beside him in silence, her movements steady but deliberate, mending a torn saddlebag, folding blankets with a precision that suggested ritual rather than routine. Yet her gaze kept drifting to the horizon, her eyes narrowing as if she could will the riders into existence. "They'll come early," she said at last, her voice low but certain, like a blade drawn from its sheath. Tommy didn't ask why. He just handed her a length of leather, supple and sun-darkened, its edges frayed but still strong. "Thought you might want to make something from it," he muttered, his throat tight around the words. She took it without thanks, but her fingers lingered on his, the contact brief yet electric, a spark in the frost. Later, he found her stitching a tunic from blue cotton near the hearth, her hands moving with a precision that bordered on ceremonial. The fabric had been his purchase in town, a bold, defiant color that seemed to swallow the firelight. And now it took shape under her fingers, the needle flashing like a star in the dim room. Each stitch was deliberate, almost reverent, as though she were binding something sacred into the threads. The tunic would be hers, a declaration of selfhood in a world that had tried to carve her into something else. At dusk, she hummed a lullaby in Comanche, the notes curling around the fire like smoke, soft and persistent. The melody seeped into Tommy's bones, dragging memories he'd buried deep. His daughter's tiny hands, never opened. Lena Boone's laughter, bright as the creek's spring rush. The grave beneath the cedar tree, its soil hardened by winter's grip. He closed his eyes, the ache in his chest sharp but familiar, a wound that had never quite closed. When Kaya Wren asked about Lena Boone, her voice breaking the lullaby's spell, he froze. "She's gone," he said, the words flat, as though stating a fact too heavy to feel. Kaya Wren paused, her needle hovering above the fabric. "So am I," she replied quietly, "but we're both still here." The fire spat, a log collapsing into embers. In the sudden flare of light, Tommy saw her more clearly. The resilience in her posture, the wariness in her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands as she gripped the tunic. She was not fearless. She was afraid, but she stood anyway. Like Lena Boone had, when she planted wildflowers around the cedar tree every spring, knowing they would never bloom after winter took her. Like Kaya Wren's mother, who had washed her hair in the river until sickness stole her. Like the girl herself, who had run from a life carved by others' hands and dared to stitch her own. Tommy looked down at his hands, rough and scarred, and wondered if they could hold something as fragile as hope. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. The storm was coming, he knew, but for now, there was only this. A girl who had brought a war to his doorstep and a man who had spent too long hiding from the living. 3 days. That was all they had before the sky split open. The third night came with wind, but no snow, a restless gale that clawed at the cabin's logs like a thing denied rest. The fire crackled low in the hearth, its embers glowing like the last breaths of a dying star, casting flickering shadows that danced across Kaya Wren's hands as she worked. Tommy sat beside her, guiding her fingers through the intricate twists of rawhide, his calloused palms brushing hers as he corrected the tension in the knots. The leather resisted at first, stubborn and dry, but under his instruction, it began to yield, bending into something useful, something shaped by patience. She mimicked his movements with quiet intensity, her brow furrowed, her lips parted just enough to catch the faintest traces of her own breath. When her fingers faltered, he didn't chide her, only covered her hand with his steady and sure, guiding the braid into symmetry. The reins would hold firm under a pulling horse, he assured her, though his voice was rough with disuse. She nodded, her eyes lingering on his hands, the way they moved with the certainty of a man who had once mended broken bones, stitched wounds, and now, perhaps, was trying to mend something else entirely. She taught him in turn, her patience unnerving as she showed him how to bind feathers to arrow shafts. The quills were stripped from a hawk he'd found dead beneath the cedar tree weeks prior, its wings still intact, its spirit lingering in the air. Kaya Wren's voice was a low hum as she explained the balance required. The weight of the fletching, the angle of the tie, the way the wind itself dictated the flight. Tommy listened, his fingers clumsy but earnest, his mind drifting to the daughter he'd never named. He imagined her hands, small and soft, learning this same craft, her laughter rising above the prairie wind. The thought lodged in his throat like a splinter, sharp and unshakable. When he faltered, dropping a feather into the fire's glow, Kaya Wren only retrieved it, placing it back in his palm without judgment. Again, she said simply, her voice a steady river carrying him forward. By the fire, they shared broth and silence, the kind that wasn't empty but full of things unsaid, of choices unspoken. The stew simmered in the pot, its scent mingling with the smoke, the earthy tang of wild onion and pork grounding them in a moment. Tommy watched Kaya Wren blow on her bowl before sipping, her lashes fluttering against the steam. She ate slowly, deliberately, her movements precise, almost ceremonial. He wondered if she, too, tasted ghosts in her food. When she finished, she leaned her head against his chair, her braid slung over one shoulder, its weight pressing into the wood like an anchor. Her hair grazed his arm, the faintest brush of strands dark as river silt, and he froze, the mug in his hands forgotten. He wanted to tell her about the dreams, the daughter he'd never named, the wife he'd failed, but the words stuck, tangled in the scar tissue of his chest. Instead, he asked, "What's her name?" She looked up, startled, her dark eyes widening as if the question had unearthed something buried. "Kaya Wren," she said, the syllables soft on her tongue, a name that carried the weight of rivers and roots. He rolled it there, tasting it like a prayer, letting it settle into the hollows where his own losses lived. "Kaya Wren," he repeated, the sound rougher in his voice, a foreign melody finding its rhythm. She exhaled, a sound like wind through sagebrush, as if hearing it for the first time, not as a label, but as a truth reclaimed. Her fingers brushed his wrist, tentative yet certain, and for a moment, the silence between them felt like a bridge, not a barrier. Outside, the wind shifted, howling through the cedar branches like a thing mourning its own voice. The storm was coming, not of snow, but of decisions sharpened to a point, of hooves that would soon drum against the earth, of a father who would ride not as a man, but as a chief. Yet here, in the fragile pocket of firelight, the world narrowed to two pairs of hands, two breaths sinking in the dark, two souls stitching themselves into the same story, one thread at a time. Tommy stared into the flames, the shadows deepening the lines of his face, and wondered if he could bear to lose her, or if he'd already begun to weave her into the fabric of his survival. Kaya Wren's head tilted slightly, her gaze tracing the curve of his jaw, as if memorizing the shape of his quiet. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She didn't need to. The wind spoke for them both, carrying the weight of what was to come, while the fire held the space of what was still possible. Dawn broke gray and brittle. The sky a sheet of cracked pewter stretched taut over the horizon. The air hung motionless, heavy with the promise of frost, as Micah Stone's warriors arrived without drums, without yells. Just a wall of riders, silent as shadows. Their horses moved like phantoms through the half-light, hooves muffled by the churned snow of the previous night's storm. Tommy stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching against the wood. Kaya ran beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm like a question mark. Her breath fogged the cold air, but she didn't shiver. Micah Stone dismounted first, his wolf cloak whipping like wings as he landed in the snow, its pale fibers clinging to the hem of his trousers. His warriors fanned out behind him, a semicircle of painted faces and unblinking eyes, their spears held low but ready. The silence was a blade pressed against the throat of the morning, sharp and unyielding. "She returns," Micah Stone said, his voice gravel and thunder, the words neither a command nor a request, but a verdict carved into the space between them. Tommy's jaw tightened, his fingers brushing the rifle above the door before he forced his hands back to his sides. "She's not property," he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. Micah Stone's gaze flicked to Kaya Wren, then back to Tommy, his expression unreadable beneath streaks of ochre and ash. "She's daughter," he answered, each syllable deliberate, as though invoking a law older than language itself. "That's not ownership. That's bond." The word bond lingered like smoke, thick and acrid, and Tommy felt Kaya Wren stiffen beside him. She stepped forward, her braids swinging like a pendulum of defiance, her voice cutting the air with the precision of a blade. "Then let it die," she said, her tone quiet but unshakable. "If it was built on silence." Micah Stone's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his cheekbone. For a moment, the wind held its breath, the horses stilled, the world narrowing to the space between father and daughter. Tommy saw the tension in the man's shoulders, the way his fingers twitched toward the knife at his belt, a gesture of restraint, not aggression. "You would stay with a man who doesn't know our ways?" Micah Stone growled, his eyes darting to Tommy, then back to her. Kaya Wren's gaze met Tommy's, her dark eyes burning with something fierce and unyielding. "He let me be," she said, her voice steady, almost reverent. "He saw me before he needed me to be anything." The words landed like stones in a river, rippling outward, unsettling the stillness. Micah Stone's expression shifted, not softening but recalibrating, as though measuring the weight of a truth he hadn't anticipated. Without another word, Micah Stone unhooked the knife from his belt, its blade long and ceremonial, etched with carvings that glinted faintly in the pale light. He held it out like a test, the hilt trembling slightly in his outstretched hand. "Hunt with me," he said, his voice low but commanding. "One deer, one path. If you walk it without flinching, you prove you'll carry her weight." Tommy hesitated, his eyes flicking to Kaya Wren, who gave the barest shake of her head, a silent plea, or perhaps a warning. But Micah Stone's gaze was unrelenting, a challenge carved into the marrow of his bones. Tommy stepped forward, his boots sinking into the snow as he took the bow offered to him, its string taut and familiar. The weapon felt foreign yet instinctive, a relic of a life he'd buried beneath years of silence. The forest swallowed them whole as they rode deeper into the pines, the tension thicker than the trees. The air grew damp, the scent of moss and earth mingling with the metallic tang of anticipation. Tommy's horse snorted softly, its breath pluming in the cold, while Micah Stone rode ahead, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the underbrush with the precision of a man who had spent decades reading the language of the wild. Tommy's mind raced. This was not just a hunt, but a reckoning, a test of worthiness that extended beyond skill or strength. It was a demand to prove he could bear the weight of Kaya Wren's choices, her scars, her survival. When the buck emerged, a regal, broad-antlered creature drinking at a frost-rimmed stream, Tommy's breath caught. Micah Stone motioned silently, dismounting with the grace of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Tommy followed suit, his boots crunching against the frozen earth as he knocked an arrow, the fletching cool against his fingertips. The buck's head lifted, ears twitching, its dark eyes locking onto Tommy's for a heartbeat before it vanished into the trees. Micah Stone said nothing, only gestured toward the tracks, their prints fresh and deep in the mud. The chase began, a silent duel between man and forest, the pines closing in like sentinels bearing witness. Tommy's pulse thrummed in his ears as they moved, his breath shallow, his focus narrowing to the rhythm of his steps, the creak of branches, the distant crash of hooves. Micah Stone moved like a shadow, his presence both guide and gauntlet, pushing Tommy to the edge of his endurance. When the buck finally halted at a clearing, Tommy raised the bow, his hand steady despite the storm in his chest. The arrow flew true, striking just behind the shoulder, a clean kill that left the animal crumpling without a sound. Micah Stone nodded once, a flicker of approval in his eyes, before turning to Tommy. "You do not speak like us," he said, his voice softer now, almost contemplative. "But your actions say what your mouth does not." The ride back was quiet, the forest holding its breath around them. Tommy felt the weight of Micah Stone's judgment lift, replaced by something heavier, a fragile truce, a tentative recognition that neither man fully trusted but both respected. When they reached the cabin, the warriors stood waiting, their expressions unreadable. Micah Stone dismounted, his movements deliberate, and turned to Kaya Wren. "You are no longer of my fire," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a door closing, "but not gone from my heart." He touched her forehead with 2 fingers, then turned and walked to his horse, the warriors following his lead. As the sound of hooves faded into the horizon, Tommy exhaled, the tension in his chest unraveling like old thread. Kaya Wren stepped close, her hand brushing his arm, her eyes searching his face for something unspoken. "You didn't flinch," she said softly. Tommy looked down at his calloused hands, the bow still in his grip, and wondered if he'd passed the test or merely survived it. The arrow struck true, piercing the buck's heart just as the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and steady, like the sky releasing a breath it had held for too long. The deer collapsed without a sound, its dark eyes wide and unblinking, its body sinking into the damp earth as the forest seemed to exhale around it. Tommy and Micah Stone stood in the muted light, the rain glinting on their faces, neither speaking as they bound the carcass to a travois. Micah Stone's warriors waited in silence at the edge of the clearing, their painted faces streaked with water, their horses shifting restlessly beneath the weight of the storm. As they rode back toward the cabin, the rain washed the snow clean, erasing tracks, softening edges, as though the land itself were preparing for a new chapter. When they reached the porch, Micah Stone dismounted first, his movements deliberate, his wolf cloak heavy with water. He approached Kaya Wren, his gaze lingering on her face as if memorizing the lines of it, then raised a hand to touch her forehead, a gesture both blessing and farewell. "You are no longer of my fire," he said, his voice gravel and wind, "but not gone from my heart." The words hung between them, thick with the weight of all they could not undo. Without another glance at Tommy, Micah turned and mounted his horse, the warriors falling into formation behind him. They left without ceremony, their hooves drumming against the softened earth, fading into the horizon until only the echo of their departure remained. Inside the cabin, Kaya Wren unwrapped herself from her soaked tunic and reached for Lena Boone's shawl, now stitched with a strip of blue cloth at the hem, a quiet collaboration of past and present. She draped it over her shoulders, the fibers still carrying the faint scent of sage and smoke, and crossed the room to where Tommy stood, his hands braced on the back of a chair, exhaustion and relief warring in his posture. She pressed her lips to his, a kiss that anchored them both, slow and certain, as though sealing a vow neither had spoken aloud. No words were needed. The rain tapping against the roof, the fire crackling in the hearth, and the steady beat of their intertwined fingers said enough. Months passed, the seasons bending around them like grass in a prairie wind. The town still whispered, of course. Gossips clung to rumors like burrs to wool, but the edges of their judgment softened with time. Miss Lahi began setting aside bolts of fabric in the back of her store, one she thought Kaya Wren might like, though she never mentioned it aloud. A boy from a neighboring farm lingered at the cabin's door one afternoon, holding out a bundle of feathers and asking, with hesitant respect, if she would teach him to bind them to arrows. Tommy watched these exchanges in quiet wonder, his hands busy mending tack or carving bone beads, his shoulders lighter with each small step Kaya Wren took toward belonging. One evening, as winter's frost began to loosen its grip, Tommy sat by the fire with a cradle in his lap, his hands steady for the first time in years. The wood was smooth beneath his calloused fingers, the curves of it echoing the shape of a promise he had once buried beneath grief. Kaya Wren leaned against the doorway, her belly rounded now, her hands cradling herself like a prayer already answered. She watched him work, the firelight catching the gold in her eyes, and said quietly, "You're lighter." Tommy looked up, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "I don't carry it alone anymore," he replied, his voice rough with the weight of all he had learned to share. Outside, the stars burned fierce and infinite, their light spilling across the prairie like spilled grain, while the wind carried no storms, only the faint, sweet promise of tomorrow. In the stillness between breaths, Tommy whispered, "Some stories begin with fire, some with ash, but ours began the moment I opened that door." Kaya Wren stepped closer, her hand settling over his heart, her own voice a thread of warmth in the quiet. And I walked in. Together, they remained, two quiet souls who had once lived in storms, now wrapped in firelight, building a life not of conquest, but of consent, not of rescue, but of recognition. They had endured the long ride. They had made a home,